My name is Jackson. I'm 34 years old and I live in Denver, Colorado. I never thought something so strange could happen to a group of friends until that night. It all started when we decided to take a weekend trip to camp. We had done this before in some mountains, but the frozen lake we chose this time seemed different. My friends and I were excited. Some of us loved the idea of exploring somewhere more isolated, and the cold wasn't an issue. After all, we were prepared. The trip was smooth, and when we arrived at the camp, night had already fallen. Snow was gently falling, and the moon lit up the scene, creating a somewhat magical atmosphere. We set up the tents, lit a fire, and started talking. We were laughing, telling funny stories, and having a drink. The tranquility of the place made us relax, but for some reason, I felt something was a bit off. I just didn't know what. The tension was there, but I thought it was just the wild nature of the place. It was already late when something strange happened. We were all sitting around the fire when we heard a sound. It wasn't the wind or branches moving. It was a dull thud coming from the frozen lake. At first, we thought it was the sound of an animal moving on the ice. But then another, louder thud was heard. We all fell silent, trying to understand what was happening. I looked at my friends and saw the same confusion, the same doubt on their faces. No one dared to suggest it could be something supernatural, but as the thuds kept going, it became clear we couldn't just ignore it. The snow covered the lake, and there were no signs of life. But those thuds, they were like something trying to break free from under the ice. It was the sound of something trying to come up from the bottom of the lake. My chest tightened. The silence among us was almost tangible. Finally, someone suggested we go investigate the lake. Maybe it was just a trick of our imagination. Maybe the ice wasn't as thick as it seemed and cracked a bit, Brian said, trying to ease the tension. The idea of investigating seemed ridiculous, but curiosity got the best of us. We approached the edge of the lake, and the sound suddenly stopped. We stood there for a few minutes, staring at the dark ice below. The water was completely still. No movement, no waves, nothing. Just silence. That's when I saw something. In the middle of the lake, the ice seemed thinner, or maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But after a while, I realized there was something beneath the surface. I couldn't make out exactly what it was, but a cold shiver ran down my spine. The others started to get closer and asked in hushed voices what I was seeing. Maybe it's just a crack in the ice, Steve suggested. But as the night went on, the thuds returned. They were louder now, but more consistent, like something was forcing its way through the ice trying to emerge. We decided we couldn't ignore it anymore. One of us, I don't even remember who, suggested it might be a good idea to try and see what was under the ice. The ice didn't seem that thick there, and if something was trapped, maybe we should find out. We started carefully breaking the top layer of ice using pickaxes and pieces of wood we found. The sound kept going, and with every movement of the ice, the feeling of invading something deep, something dangerous, grew stronger. It didn't take long before we managed to break a large enough part to see something that, at the time, I could only describe as strange. A body, deep under the ice. When the first part of the body appeared, we froze, but not in a good way. What we saw looked like a person, but they were unrecognizable, so disfigured and frozen. But there was something even stranger. The clothes. The body was wearing exactly the same jacket as Brian, a black jacket he had worn for years. We couldn't believe what we were seeing. How could something like that be there? And what was that body? Brian was in shock, his eyes wide, his mouth trembling with fear. He stammered, unable to say anything. He just stared at the body. I tried pulling him back, but something inside me also couldn't look away. Something about that place seemed to pull my attention, like it was waiting for something. The air was tense and fear was taking over all of us. We started shouting for help, but we knew no one was around. Our only option was to head back to the tent, but no one could tear themselves away from the lake. We didn't know what to do. The frozen body, Brian's familiar jacket, and the feeling that none of this made sense were consuming us. We knew we had to leave. When we finally pulled away, the thuds intensified, as if something was getting closer to the surface. The image of that body, that jacket, was still burned in our minds. We ran back to the camp, the ice cracking beneath our feet, as if everything around us was falling apart. None of us ever went back to that lake. And no matter how much we tried to rationalize what happened, no explanation made sense. What did we really find? What were those thuds? And how was the body of someone who looked like Brian there? To this day, I still have nightmares about that night. And the weirdest part of all, after we left, no one ever heard the thuds again. The ice stayed silent, like it had never made those sounds. What happened that night? Well, that remains a mystery, one of those mysteries you can never figure out. To this day, I don't know what I saw. Hi, my name is Alden. I'm 35 years old, and I live in Burlington, Vermont. What I'm about to tell you happened about 3 years ago, on Christmas Eve, and to this day I still can't understand what happened. I was working that day, and as usual, I went to spend the holiday with my wife and children. But what was supposed to be a peaceful Christmas night turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. My wife and I decided to hire a babysitter to stay with the kids while we went to a party in town. Our 2 little ones, Emma and Lucas, love staying home, watching Christmas movies and playing, so we felt comfortable knowing they were in good hands. The babysitter, named Kate, was hired through a trusted agency, and she seemed very responsible based on the references we checked. She agreed to work late that night, and we left as planned. I fully trusted that everything would go well, as it always had with previous sitters. When we returned, around midnight, something was off. The house was silent, and right at the entrance we noticed the lights were off. It was strange because Kate always left a light on for the kids to feel safer. I quickly ran upstairs, calling Emma and Lucas by name, but they were in their room, alone, both visibly frightened. I was relieved to see they were okay, but their response was the first strange thing of the night. "Where's Kate?" I asked, somewhat suspicious of the situation. Lucas, the youngest, simply looked at me and said, "She went away." I was confused. "What do you mean she went away?" "She had a contract to stay with them until after midnight." Then Emma, calmer, said, "She was downstairs, but then she disappeared. We don't know where she went." Apparently, the kids were scared and couldn't understand what had happened. They spoke calmly, but I could tell something was wrong. The fear in their eyes made me uneasy. I started getting irritated and worried at the same time. I went downstairs and noticed there were no signs of the babysitter. No bags, no jacket tossed on the chair. It seemed like she had just left in the middle of the night without leaving any trace. The strangest thing was that the security cameras I had installed all over the house didn't show anything. I thought maybe it was a technical error, so I went to the monitoring system and reviewed the footage. What I saw made my stomach turn. The cameras showed the living room empty until about an hour before our arrival. Then a dark figure, shapeless and undefined, appeared in the footage. It stood still in the corner of the room, motionless, watching the kids while they watched TV, completely unaware of its presence. There was no sign of Kate at any moment, just this shadowy figure, which seemed to move in a strange way, almost like it was floating. When the kids looked to the side, the figure disappeared, but the feeling that someone was there watching was chilling. What was most disturbing was that the kids didn't seem to notice, but I knew it was there. How was this possible? I replayed the video several times, trying to understand what was happening. The figure seemed to be just observing. There was no physical movement suggesting any immediate threat, but the sense of unease was undeniable. What was most disturbing was realizing that the figure never moved, but it seemed like it was waiting for something. At one point, it just disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the darkness. I felt powerless, not knowing what to do with those images, with the growing fear that seemed to take over my mind. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a recording error or some kind of distortion caused by low light, but my instinct wouldn't let me rest. The kids started acting strangely after that night. Emma, who had always been the braver one, began having nightmares and didn't want to sleep alone. Lucas became more shy, and sometimes when he spoke about the babysitter, his eyes filled with tears. I tried talking to them, but I couldn't understand what was going on. There was something in the air, something you couldn't see, but it was palpable. The house felt colder after that Christmas. That particular winter felt heavier, like the house was loaded with something invisible. I started reviewing the footage almost every day, hoping to see something that would give me a logical explanation. I tried talking to my wife about what I saw, but she was so involved with work and the kids that she preferred to ignore it, thinking I was just exaggerating. Still, she noticed the change in the kids. Something was definitely wrong, but we didn't know what it was. We tried to go on with our lives, but things were never the same. Sometimes, when I was alone in the house, I could swear I felt a presence. It wasn't something you could see or hear clearly, but the feeling of being watched was always there, looming, especially when the house was quiet at night. I wondered if it was just my mind trying to process the fear and anxiety of what had happened, but the fact that the kids reacted the same way only made me more paranoid. The strange behavior from the kids only increased. Emma, for example, started asking to sleep with a light on, even if it was just a faint lamp. And Lucas sometimes spoke about the person who was always watching. He said he didn't like the person, and that they were always there, waiting. But when I asked who it was, he would just look at me frightened, as if it was obvious, but he didn't want to say more about it. We never found an explanation for what happened that night. The cameras never recorded anything strange again, but the feeling that something was wrong never went away. How is it possible that a shadowy figure entered the house without being seen? How is it possible that the cameras didn't show anything except a ghostly image? The worst part was that, over time, I began to doubt what I saw. Was my mind creating something, or was it real? Now, 3 years later, the kids seem calmer, but the fear still lingers in my mind. I still can't understand what happened, and even though I try to convince myself that it was all just a collective nightmare, a part of me knows it was real. We never found out what happened to Kate. She never showed up again, and the agency never knew anything. I went looking for her, but all I got were vague answers and a growing feeling that everything was planned, or at least beyond our understanding. I left the story behind for a while, but I always come back to it. I've never talked about the footage with the kids, and I don't think I ever will. I'm afraid that if I do, they'll remember things they don't want to remember. That Christmas will always be a mystery to me, something that remains like a shadow hanging over my life. If anyone out there has gone through something similar, or has any idea of what happened, I'd really like to hear it. Maybe one day I'll understand. My name is Lucas Caldwell. I'm 34 years old and I live in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I've always been a rational person who didn't believe in those ghost stories people hear about. I always viewed those kinds of tales as myths that people make up for fun or to scare others. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that not everything can be explained with logic and reason. What happened to me in that house in the countryside changed my perspective forever, and to this day, I feel uneasy just thinking about it. It all started when I first heard about the house. It was in a conversation with an old friend I met when I moved to Sioux Falls. He told me about the house in the countryside that had always been surrounded by strange stories. According to him, anyone who spent the night there always woke up in the middle of the night with vivid nightmares, and people began to dream about two twin siblings who, apparently, had been murdered in the house more than 100 years ago. The story was interesting, but like any other ghost story, I treated it as superstition. As I always did, I smiled and said I would visit the place just to prove that it was nothing like that. The house was out in the middle of nowhere, far from any town. When I found the place, my stomach churned. I didn't know what to expect, but the house had a strange look about it. It looked like it had been there since the 19th century, with weathered wood, a roof falling apart, and a door that creaked as if it were complaining. The feeling of desolation was palpable. The wind made the trees around it sway, but the sound didn't bring any life to the place. It was a deep silence, the kind of silence you only find in places where time has stopped. I took a deep breath and entered. I had never seen a house so abandoned. The inside was as dilapidated as the outside. The walls were dirty, covered in a thick layer of dust, and the smell of mold mixed with something else, something I couldn't identify. The floor creaked under every step I took, and the only light came from a broken window in the corner of the room. The air was heavy, as if the house was trying to swallow me whole, but I pressed on. Without thinking much, I grabbed my backpack and decided to go upstairs, where I planned to spend the night. I thought of it as my test, to prove that there was nothing supernatural about that place. The stairs were dark, almost as if they were trying to keep me away from the second floor. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was dustier and the air colder. The smell of rotting wood mixed with stagnant air made me feel a lump in my throat. Every corner seemed to be watching me, but I didn't want to give in to it. I tried to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. My goal was to spend the night there and debunk that silly story. I entered what seemed to be the master bedroom. A worn-out bed and a chair leaned against the wall. There was nothing else, just the silence that surrounded me. It was a strange feeling. It wasn't the fear of ghosts or monsters. It was the fear of something I couldn't understand, of something there that I couldn't see. The house seemed alive. I knew it didn't make sense, but something inside me couldn't ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. No matter how hard I tried, the idea that something was there refused to leave my mind. I tried to relax, lay on the bed and closed my eyes, trying to block out all thoughts. When I was finally starting to drift off, I heard something that made me sit up instantly. A laugh. A low, faint laugh, but clear. It didn't sound like an adult, but a child. I stayed still, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I heard small footsteps, almost as if someone was running upstairs. It couldn't be. The house was empty. There was no one there, just me. My body tensed, and a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't move. But I couldn't stay there either. I couldn't let my mind play any more tricks on me. I quickly got up and walked to the hallway, looking in every direction, but I saw nothing. There were no more sounds. Nothing. Just the darkness and the silence, as if nothing had ever happened. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I'm losing my mind, I thought. It's just my head. But when I looked at the end of the hallway, something strange happened. There, in the door of one of the rooms, I saw a shadow. It was a small shape, almost like a child. I blinked and the shadow disappeared. What was that? I didn't know what to do. The fear took over me, and I felt like I had to get out of there as fast as possible. But instead of leaving, I entered the room. It was a child's room, with a small bed and toys scattered on the floor, but nothing seemed to be in place. Everything was out of context, as if it had been left there by someone who just disappeared. What bothered me the most was the painting on the wall. It was a portrait of two twins, a boy and a girl. Their eyes, though painted, seemed alive, and worse, it seemed like they were watching me. I couldn't look away, and a shiver ran down my body. It felt like the eyes of the twins were calling me, as if they were waiting for me right there, in that moment. That's when I heard the footsteps again. They were closer now, as if they were approaching me. When I turned around to run toward the door, the footsteps behind me grew faster. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see anything more. I ran out of the house in a hurry, and the door slammed behind me with such force it almost knocked me down. When I got into the car, I looked at the house one last time. The second-floor window was open, and a shadow passed by it. I knew what had happened there wasn't normal. It wasn't a coincidence. I drove home as quickly as I could, but during the drive I couldn't shake the sounds of laughter and small footsteps from my mind. I didn't know what was real and what was just my mind playing tricks, but what I saw there was too real to be just a hallucination. After researching more about the house on the internet, I discovered that the twins had been killed there in a tragic accident in the 19th century. Some people say it was a fire, others say the twins died of natural causes, but no one knows for sure. What still haunts me to this day isn't knowing how or why they died, but the fact that they still seem to be there, waiting. I've never gone back to that house, and I don't know if I ever would. That experience showed me that there are things in the world that simply can't be explained. My name is Tyler, I'm 32 years old, and I live in a very remote place in Minnesota, practically at the end of the world. I moved here because of work, and being more of an introverted person, solitude has never bothered me much. When I moved here, I knew the winters would be harsh, but I never imagined that something so strange would happen on one of the coldest nights of my life. It was a Friday night and a snowstorm was forming. Here, in the winter, the storms can be fierce. The snow begins to fall with immense force, and the wind is so cold it feels like it cuts through your skin. Everything outside becomes quiet, yet the storm seems to have a life of its own, roaring, pounding against the windows. I was at home, alone, as usual, watching TV when I received a notification on my phone. It was a message from my security camera app, which already made me feel uncomfortable. Normally, the cameras only alert me if something unusual happens, like movement near my house. But at that moment, I couldn't see anything but the snow falling outside. Curious, I opened the app and saw something that made my heart stop for a second. Footprints in the snow. They started outside my house and went straight to my front door. At first I thought it might be some animal, maybe a squirrel or a deer, but the footprints weren't from any of those. They were too large, and worse, they looked very human. My hands became cold and my stomach churned. I'm not a paranoid person, but being completely alone in an isolated house and seeing something that was enough to make me scared. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what was going on. The footprints kept appearing, and contrary to what I expected, they didn't stop. They just kept appearing, going straight to the door. There was no wind to blow them away, and the storm seemed to be so intense that it wasn't possible for someone to be out there at that very moment. I felt a chill in my chest, as if the air around me had become thicker. I tried to rationalize it, but the more I looked at the screen, the more the footprints formed. They were clear, distinct, as if someone were walking in the snow, marking the path straight to my door. The panic set in. I didn't know what to do. I knew there was no one else around. The wind was so strong I couldn't even hear anything outside. The feeling that I was being watched was unbearable. Every time I looked, the footprints kept advancing. Suddenly something broke the silence. The front door made a noise, as if something had hit it. I looked at the camera monitor, but the screen was black. What was happening? The camera was no longer working. I tried restarting the app, but with no success. I couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything. It was as if the house had been swallowed by the storm. The only real things were the footprints in the snow, which seemed to go straight to my door. Fear overtook me. I closed the curtains and locked the door, but still couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. They kept appearing, even after I had locked everything. My body was on high alert, my muscles tense. The thought that someone was out there watching my house made me even more nervous. I looked out the window, but I didn't see anything. What could be going on? A cruel prank? I didn't know, but one thing was clear. Something wasn't right. At that moment, the only thing that made me think of any solution was to call the police. I'm not the type of person to panic easily, but the feeling that something was about to happen was overwhelming. I quickly called, my voice trembling, asking them to send a patrol to investigate. I didn't know what else to do. The police told me to stay calm and informed me that they would be there soon. But what made me even more uneasy was the silence. I didn't hear anything from the storm outside, as if the sound of the wind had disappeared. The house was silent, and this deep silence only made me feel more paranoid. Time seemed to drag on. I kept staring at the footprints in the snow, which had now reached my door, but I couldn't see any more movement. The snow was slowly covering the marks on the ground. I stood there, waiting, not knowing what else might happen. Every sound in the house felt louder, more threatening. The noise of something falling to the ground, the wind that suddenly intensified. Every noise made it feel as though something was there, just close by, but I couldn't see it. I didn't know what was going on, and more than anything, I didn't know what to expect. After what felt like hours, I finally heard the siren of the police approaching. I could barely wait to tell them what had happened. When the officers arrived, I led them to the area outside where the footprints were visible. They looked at the ground and crouched down near the door. The officer seemed confused, looking at the footprints with an uncomfortable expression. He asked me if anyone had entered the house, and I told him no. The door had been locked and closed since I first saw the footprints on the camera. They entered the house to investigate, and when they came back, They were visibly perplexed. The front door was open, which didn't make sense. But the strangest thing was that, although the footprints were clearly visible, there was no sign of anyone leaving the house. How was that possible? No one could enter without leaving tracks, yet the door was open and the footprints were there, as if someone had stopped at the door and simply disappeared. The police kept investigating the area around the house, checking every corner. They didn't find any sign of break-in or intrusion. They looked at the bushes, the trees, but nothing. There were no traces of anyone. The footprints didn't continue away from the house, and the entrance door hadn't been forced. Everything seemed normal, except for the footprints that didn't make sense. They told me that it was probably someone who had approached my house, maybe someone from a distant neighborhood or someone with strange intentions, but even then, nothing added up. I knew it wasn't something normal. That feeling of being watched, of something being there, didn't leave me. I felt that there was something more in that place, something I couldn't understand yet. To this day, the police haven't found any logical explanation. There haven't been any more strange events after that night, but what happened during that storm, in the midst of the cold and solitude, still haunts me. I don't know what I saw or what happened. All I know is that night, I was alone, but it felt like something was with me. And every time I look at the snow outside, I wonder if that thing will somehow come back.